Bitter cold is descending on us here in Europe. The sudden arrival of wintry weather could spell disaster for a region already in the midst of an energy crisis.
And if we're a little bit unlucky this winter, it could turn into a crisis because, and this is the real problem I find, is we are at the mercy of the weather now.
I think we are going to be walking into a recession because there won't be enough energy to be had.
Whatever you want to call it, a crisis, a crunch, a shortage, what's been unfolding across global energy markets this year is impacting all of our lives. Energy prices have soared, with benchmark European natural gas prices jumping almost 400%. Even prices for coal, which is being shunned by many countries, have almost doubled. That means in almost every corner of the world, the energy needed to heat our homes or fuel our cars or power our businesses has become drastically more expensive. This has been described as the first energy crisis of the green transition. And it's true that looming behind every aspect of this energy shortage is climate change. But there are so many different causes for this year's energy crisis, at least 15 according to one list that an expert sent me. We won't get into all of them, but we will look at some of the most significant factors behind the crunch and what they tell us about the future of energy as the green transition gains speed. That's all coming up on Business Beyond. The simplest answer for this year's energy crisis is the pandemic. The first months of the COVID-19 pandemic led many economies to shut down. Demand for energy plunged as businesses closed, people stayed home, and planes were grounded around the world. And so fossil fuel producers responded. They stopped drilling for oil, cut back on natural gas production, and even closed coal mines. This year, economies have roared back to life, and the speed of that recovery has caught pretty much the entire world off guard. And we're not just talking about energy suppliers. You probably have heard of the global supply chain crisis or the semiconductor shortage. All of these have a common cause, the unexpected bounce back in demand.
That is good news in a way, in the sense that as the economy has been picking up again after the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen higher energy demand from various economic sectors.
It's all part of the globally disrupted supply chains, from computer chips to containers to gas, because yes, hopefully we'll be coming out of this COVID pandemic at some point. The long-term fallout that we really didn't think about when we were all in lockdown, it's like how to sort everything out again.
But the timing of this year's energy crisis is a bit ironic, because the shortage of fossil fuels to power our economies comes as many countries are making plans to abandon them once and for all.
2070 तक भारत नेट जीरो का लक्ष्य हासिल करेगा.
We are on course to achieve our goal, our target of 100% use of clean energy by 2030.
We are, in fact, closer than we have ever been before to avoiding climate chaos.
Despite all of these big pronouncements and pledges to become greener, the pandemic has shown us a bitter reality. The world is still very much dependent on fossil fuels. Even here in Germany, which has a reputation as a climate leader, we still got most of our energy from non-renewable sources in the first half of this year. On a global scale, that energy balance skews drastically more towards fossil fuels.
The underlying issue is demand is just, it takes a long time for demand to switch away from fossil fuels. In 1981, oil, gas, and coal account for 84% of total energy demand. Last year, that share was still 84%.
The first place where we really started to see energy shortages unfold this year was in China. China's economy was the first to bounce back from the pandemic thanks to demand for its goods from abroad. Its factories went into overdrive, requiring huge amounts of fuel. For China, that largely means coal, which still accounts for 70% of its electricity generation. But a number of factors, from a de facto ban on Australian coal to strict electricity pricing, meant that supply didn't keep up. By September, China was in the throes of an energy crisis. The government ordered factories to close and told coal mines to increase production. The blackouts and power cuts to key industries have had a serious impact on China's economy. And it's basically led Beijing to double down on coal. Many fear that that will jeopardize China's climate goals. With the coal shortage at home, China turned to international natural gas markets to help keep the lights on and factories running. That huge amount of demand coming from China rippled across global energy markets, including to those here in Europe. China's becoming a major force in the natural gas market as it works to wean its economy off of even more polluting coal. Each year, millions of households swap coal power for gas.
It's a laudable program. It's an anti-pollution program. So they're moving their coastal households from burning coal to using gas and to reduce pollution. It's great, and it works. China's big cities 10 years ago were the most polluted cities in the world, and now they're not anymore. So bad, but they're not the worst.
China's demand for natural gas, both during this year's crisis and in recent years, has put the squeeze on Europe. The European Union gets most of its natural gas from Russia, but Norway, Algeria, and Qatar are also big suppliers. Brussels has made diversifying its supply of natural gas a priority, and it's turned to liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which is sent via tankers like these instead of pipelines. In 2019, so pre-pandemic, LNG accounted for about 22% of the EU's natural gas consumption. That was a new record. Competition between China and Europe for LNG has been building, but this year's energy shortages led to an all-out bidding war, and Europe has been losing.
The population figures are just eye-watering. So when it gets cold there, they suck up the LNG market, and then, Europe has a bit less. But then, there's pipeline supply here. Norway, Algeria, Russia, they can supply us with gas as well. But that's where in Europe there's another problem at the moment. Actually, lots of them.
The biggest of those problems for the EU is Russia. Western Europe began importing natural gas from Russia, or more accurately, the Soviet Union, in the 1960s. There are now several pipelines that connect the Siberian gas fields of Russia's Gazprom to various storage sites across the EU. The EU's dependence on Russian gas has long worried many within the bloc.
When you build a pipeline, you build a relationship, and potentially there's leverage both ways, by the supplier, by the buyer. And so security has been a standing issue in the natural gas trade.
And those concerns have become very real this year as the EU faces a natural gas shortage. While some countries like Belgium and France have gas storage levels around 80%, storage tanks in other countries like Austria are sitting almost half empty after last year's cold winter depleted stockpiles. Making matters worse, Russia has been slow to send additional gas to Europe this year despite the critical shortage of stocks.
There is credible signs that Russia itself is struggling to meet all of the gas demand. Now, first of all, they had to fill up their own inventories ahead of the winter. And in Russia, as we all know, it gets really cold. So they can't sort of leave their own people in the cold and sell it all to plushy Western Europe.
But some analysts believe the limited deliveries are no coincidence and accuse Moscow of exploiting Europe's energy weakness.
Part of the slowdown in imports of gas from Russia, or I guess exports from Russia to us, is malicious.
Enter Nord Stream 2, the 9.5 billion euro pipeline Russia has recently completed constructing from the Russian port Ust-Luga to Greifswald, Germany. It will double Russian gas supply to Germany, but it first must be approved by German regulators. And that's not a given for a pipeline that has been embroiled in controversy from the start. Critics have found a lot of reasons to hate Nord Stream 2. They fear how it will make the EU even more dependent on Russian gas. And they worry about how it will bypass Ukraine, where much of Russia's gas to Europe now flows through. And that brings in billions of euros to Kiev every year. Some believe Russia is withholding gas exports as a way to blackmail the EU into approving the pipeline. Whether Russia is weaponizing its gas exports or not, Nord Stream 2 is crucial to Russia's economic future here in Europe. Keep in mind, about 40% of Russia's government revenues come from oil and gas exports every year.
The Russians have spent a fortune under Putin developing an entire new natural gas province, and as a result of which the Russians are positioned for the next generation of gas supply to Europe. Well, what happens if Europe then, as part of its climate policy, cuts back on natural gas consumption? What becomes of that investment then?
And it's not just Russia that's confronting a future where its biggest export is no longer needed. So is the group of oil producers that, along with Russia, is known as OPEC+. The cartel has resisted increasing oil production despite rising prices. OPEC has blamed uncertainty about demand and the pandemic, but some see a deeper message in its refusal to bend to these demands.
We can't have consumer governments telling producer governments that we don't need oil and gas, which is absolutely the crux of their livelihood. That's where the livelihood comes from. Then those countries have every right to allow prices to go up now so that they can rebuild their coffers, rebuild their budget deficits, and just have surpluses so that when there is energy transition and their oil and gas products effectively are out of demand, they have a buffer that they can help diversify their economy.
In other words, fossil fuel producers may be motivated to try and make money while they still can. For Moscow, its current gambit to secure the future of Nord Stream 2 doesn't appear to be working. In November, German regulators suspended the approval process for the pipeline, citing issues with the parent company's business registration. That doesn't necessarily mean the end of Nord Stream 2, but it is a delay that could set the project back by several months, raising the risk of serious energy shortages here in Europe this winter.
If it gets cold for long across Northwest Europe or Northeast Asia, there's a high risk of real power and heating outages, just as COVID surges again. And then you'll have people sitting at home cold and sick.
Like I touched on earlier, some see green policies at fault for this current crisis. They say that overly ambitious targets to reduce emissions have made fossil fuels pariahs before renewables were fully ready to take up the load. And indeed, investment in oil and gas has more than halved since 2014.
The challenge is fossil fuel investment is falling very, very quickly. But for the world to keep meeting rising energy demand, investment in renewables needs to go up by 4 times. You're talking about like $100 trillion. That money is just not there, and it won't be there, that volume of money. So you're essentially talking about energy poverty versus green energy. And countries like China and India will simply not choose energy poverty.
But others are more optimistic that renewables could soon replace fossil fuels.
I think that this situation exposes not so much the fact that we have tried to decarbonize, faster than wise. This is something that sometimes you hear from the fossil fuel industry. It's not that at all, frankly. It's rather the opposite. If we had a larger share of renewables at this stage, then it would mean we would be less reliant on fossil fuels, less reliant on the energy source whose price is currently very high because of increased competition.
After all, wind and sun are essentially limitless resources. As energy sources, they can insulate countries from geopoliticking.
Our reliance on fossil fuels, such as natural gas, has shown us that it can end up in very high prices. We need to transition away from that and to a system of natural resources that are renewable and whose cost is virtually zero.
Many politicians are seizing this crisis as a chance to push for more investment in renewables. But building out that infrastructure could take years. So what about right now? For now, governments seem to have decided the answer is more fossil fuels. China, as we saw earlier, has renewed its commitment to coal. And here in the EU, where many countries have pledged to give up coal in the coming decade, idled coal plants are being put back online. In the United States, the White House has announced it will tap its strategic reserve of oil to help bring down gasoline prices for consumers. This, many analysts point out, is not the best way to get consumers to give up oil or gas.
The reality is, if supplies are coming down much, much faster and demand hasn't moved, high prices is the only solution, because only then will you actually get consumers to move away.
The fact is that if you put a price on fossil fuels without there being a clean alternative that consumers can shift to and that is also affordable, then behavior change is made more difficult and consumers are going to be left frustrated.
And that's where many people are finding themselves now. Frustrated, furious, at risk of not being able to cover their own energy needs. So what are we to take away from all of this?
For me, in another hour, I will start the engine on my car and I will know why I'm dependent on fossil fuels. And so in the words of a famous cartoon of years ago, we have met the enemy and he is us.
For all of the excitement around the green transition, fossil fuels still power our lives. And until that changes, fossil fuels and the countries that produce them will continue to determine how much it costs to keep the lights on. And that's it for this episode of Business Beyond. If you liked this video, check out our playlist and see you next time.